Imagine a land where the night sky stretches endlessly above silent dunes, where the wind carries stories of forgotten truths, and where a sacred sanctuary, built for the worship of one God, stands surrounded by lifeless stone idols that cannot hear a single whisper. This was Arabia before Islam, a place full of strength and pride, yet deeply lost in purpose. Before we go deeper into this powerful journey, take a moment to connect with this message. Thank you for being here with Islamic Insight. I would truly love to know where you are watching from, so share your country in the comments. And if your heart finds peace in learning about Islam, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because what you are about to hear is not just history, it is a transformation that changed the direction of humanity. The land itself shaped the people who lived upon it. Arabia was not a place of soft comfort or easy survival. It was harsh, raw, and demanding. Endless deserts stretched across the horizon, broken only by scattered oases and small settlements where life clung tightly to scarce water and trade routes. The sun was unforgiving during the day, and the cold at night could cut just as deeply. In such an environment, weakness could not survive for long. People had to become resilient, sharp, and fiercely independent. Yet this harshness also created a certain hardness in the heart. Life was about survival first, and reflection often came second. Without a guiding revelation to shape their worldview, people relied on what they saw around them, what their ancestors practiced, and what their tribes demanded. In Islamic tradition, this period is described as Jahiliyyah, not because the people lacked intelligence, but because they lacked true guidance. They knew how to navigate the desert, how to trade across vast distances, how to compose poetry that could move entire tribes, but they did not know their Creator in the way they were meant to. The remembrance of the one God brought by Prophet Ibrahim, peace be upon him, still lingered faintly in stories and traditions, but it had been overshadowed by generations of change. What remained was a distorted understanding of faith mixed with customs that had no foundation in divine truth. Identity in this world was not built on belief or personal character, but on lineage. You were your tribe, and your tribe was you. Every individual carried the weight of their ancestry, and then loyalty to one's people was considered the highest virtue. If someone from your tribe was wronged, it was your duty to respond, regardless of whether they were right or wrong. Justice was not an objective standard applied equally to all, but something shaped by allegiance. This created a powerful sense of unity within tribes, but it also fueled endless conflict between them. A single disagreement could ignite a feud that lasted for decades, even generations, with each side seeking revenge to restore its honor. These conflicts were not always about major issues. Sometimes they began over something as small as a dispute at a marketplace or at a personal insult that wounded pride. Yet once blood was spilled, it demanded more blood. The cycle continued because backing down was seen as weakness, and weakness invited destruction. Saying there was no central authority to step in and resolve disputes fairly. Power decided outcomes, and those without strength or allies often suffered in silence. In such a system, survival depended not only on your own abilities, but on the strength of your tribe and the loyalty of those around you. Despite this harsh reality, there was a sense of dignity and pride that defined the people. Honor was everything. A person would go to great lengths to protect their reputation and the reputation of their family. Generosity was admired, especially toward guests, and stories were told of individuals who would give away their last possessions to uphold this value. Courage in battle was praised, and bravery became a defining trait. Yet these qualities, noble as they were, existed without a moral framework grounded in revelation, and they were shaped by culture rather than guided by divine instruction, which meant they could easily be twisted or misused. At the center of Arabia stood the Kaaba, a structure with a sacred history that traced back to Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail, peace be upon them. It was originally built as a place dedicated to the worship of Allah alone, a symbol of pure monotheism in a world that needed it. But over time, this purpose was forgotten. Idols were introduced, first gradually and then in overwhelming numbers. Each tribe brought its own deity, its own representation of power, until the Kaaba became surrounded by hundreds of statues made from stone, wood, and other materials. People would circle around them, offer sacrifices, and call upon them for help, believing that these lifeless objects could bring them closer to Allah. The Quran later challenges this belief directly, asking how something that cannot hear, see, or respond could possibly hold any power. Yet for the people of that time, these practices had become normal. They inherited them from their forefathers, and questioning them felt like betraying their identity. The idea of worshipping one unseen God without intermediaries seemed unfamiliar, even unsettling. Instead, they preferred tangible objects they could see and touch, even though those objects could neither benefit nor harm them. Still, not everyone was comfortable with this reality. There were individuals who sensed that something was deeply wrong. They looked at the idols and saw nothing but stone. They observed the practices of their people and felt a quiet discomfort that they could not ignore. These individuals, known as the Hunafa, rejected idol worship and sought the original faith of Ibrahim. They did not form a large movement, nor did they have a complete system of guidance, but their existence is a powerful reminder that truth has a way of lingering even in the darkest of times. This was the world just before Islam, a world full of strength yet lacking direction, full of tradition yet missing truth. It was a place where people searched for meaning in the wrong places, where loyalty could override justice, and where the sacred had been replaced with the superficial. And it is precisely in such a world that the arrival of divine guidance becomes not only significant, but absolutely transformative. If you look closer at the social fabric of that time, you begin to see a world that was not only shaped by harsh landscapes, but also by harsh realities between people themselves. Power did not just determine survival in the desert, it defined human relationships. Those who had wealth, influence, and strong tribal backing could shape outcomes in their favor, while those without protection were often left exposed, unheard, and forgotten. Justice was not a universal principle applied equally. It was something negotiated, bent, or even ignored, depending on who stood before you. The strong could demand their rights, but the weak had to hope someone would defend them, and often no one did. Among the most vulnerable in this society were orphans. A child who lost his father lost more than just a parent. He lost protection, status, and security. Without someone to guard his rights, his inheritance could easily be taken, to his voice silenced before it even had a chance to be heard. The Quran later speaks with powerful clarity about this injustice, warning against consuming the wealth of orphans and emphasizing the sacred duty to protect them. This alone tells you how widespread the problem had become, how normalized it was for the weak to be overlooked in favor of the powerful. Women, too, faced a difficult and often painful reality. Their position varied from tribe to tribe, but in many cases they were treated as possessions rather than individuals with their own dignity and rights. Marriage could become a transaction rather than a partnership, and in some situations, women themselves were inherited as part of a deceased man's estate. Their voices were rarely central in decisions that shaped their lives. And then there was one of the darkest practices, and one that shakes the heart, even to imagine it, the burial of infant girls. Driven by fear of poverty, fear of shame, or twisted ideas of honor, some would take their own daughters and bury them alive beneath the sand. The Quran later captures this moment with haunting precision, asking when the buried girl is questioned, for what sin was she killed? That question alone exposes the emptiness of the reasoning behind such cruelty. Yet even in the midst of these injustices, there were glimpses of compassion and decency. Not every person participated in such acts, and not every tribe upheld them. There were individuals who protected the weak, who showed kindness, who rejected certain customs. But these were exceptions rather than the rule. Scattered acts of goodness in a system that lacked a consistent moral compass, that without divine guidance to anchor right and wrong, people relied on inherited practices, and those practices were not always aligned with justice. At the same time, wealth played a defining role in shaping society. Mecca, in particular, stood as a center of commerce, a place where caravans arrived and departed carrying goods from distant lands. The city's location made it a crossroads of trade, connecting regions and cultures, and its people became skilled merchants who understood negotiation, travel, and the value of goods. Trade routes stretched across deserts and into lands beyond Arabia, bringing spices, textiles, and stories from far away. This constant movement created opportunity, and with opportunity came wealth for those who knew how to seize it. But wealth did not come without its consequences, and as certain families accumulated more than others, a clear divide began to emerge between those who had and those who did not. Prosperity often led to pride, and pride could easily turn into arrogance. Those who succeeded in trade sometimes saw themselves as superior, measuring worth by what one possessed rather than by character or integrity. Generosity was still praised, and many took pride in being known as generous hosts or benefactors, but it was not always consistent. Some gave out of genuine kindness, while others gave to enhance their reputation, to be spoken of in gatherings, to have their names remembered in poems. The pursuit of wealth also shaped priorities. Life became centered around profit, negotiation, and the expansion of influence. Caravans were planned with precision, risks were calculated, and alliances were formed to protect trade interests. Yet in all of this activity, something essential was missing. There was little reflection on accountability before a higher power, little awareness that wealth could be a test rather than a measure of success. The Quran would later challenge this mindset, reminding people that accumulation alone does not define true success, and that what is given by Allah can just as easily be taken away. In contrast to the material focus of trade, there was another force that shaped Arab society in a completely different way: the power of words. Language was not simply a tool for communication, it was an art form, a weapon, and a legacy all at once. Poetry held a position of immense importance. A skilled poet could raise the status of an entire tribe or bring shame upon its enemies. And verses were crafted with precision, memorized with care, and recited in gatherings where people listened with full attention. The rhythm, the imagery, the choice of words, all of it mattered deeply. These poems often spoke of bravery, love, loss, pride, and revenge. They captured moments of battle, described the beauty of the desert, and preserved the history of tribes in a way that no written record could match at the time. A powerful poem could spread quickly, carried by travelers from one gathering to another, shaping how people were perceived across regions. In a society without widespread writing, memory and oral transmission became the backbone of culture, and poets stood at the center of that system. This deep connection to language created a society that was highly sensitive to expression, and people could recognize subtle differences in wording, appreciate complex metaphors, and respond emotionally to the flow of a well-constructed verse. It was not just entertainment, it was influence. A poet could ignite pride or stir anger with a few lines, and tribes valued their poets as much as their warriors, sometimes even more. And this is where something remarkable begins to take shape. In a society that revered language at such a high level, where eloquence was a mark of excellence, a challenge was quietly forming, though no one yet realized it. Because when the Quran would later be revealed, it would enter a world that already understood the power of words, and it would present something so unmatched, so profound, that even the greatest poets would struggle to explain it. The very skill they took pride in would become the means through which they recognized something beyond human ability. So when you step back and look at this world, you see a society full of complexity. There was injustice, yet there were also moments of kindness. There was wealth, but also deep inequality. There was pride in language, yet no revelation to guide its use toward truth. It was not a simple story of darkness, but a layered reality where good and bad existed side by side, waiting for something to bring clarity, to separate truth from falsehood, and to elevate what was noble while removing what was harmful. And that moment was closer than anyone could imagine. Not everyone was at peace with the world they were born into, and this is where the story becomes even more compelling. Because in the middle of a society deeply rooted in tradition, there were individuals who quietly stepped away from what everyone else accepted without question. They were not many, and they did not form a powerful movement, but their presence carried a quiet weight. These were people who could not bring themselves to bow to stone, who looked at the idols surrounding the Kaaba and felt something was fundamentally wrong. They did not have a complete system to follow, nor did they possess a new scripture to guide them, yet they held on to a simple but powerful conviction that the truth must be greater than what their people had reduced it to. These individuals became known as the Hunafa, those who turned away from false worship and sought the pure monotheism of Ibrahim, peace be upon him. They rejected the rituals of idol worship. They refused to offer sacrifices to anything other than the one Creator, and distanced themselves from gatherings where these practices were celebrated. So, this was not an easy path to take. In a society where identity was tied so closely to shared customs, stepping away from those customs meant standing alone. It meant facing questions, suspicion, and sometimes even ridicule. Yet they persisted, driven by an inner certainty that truth was not determined by numbers or tradition, but by something deeper that resonated within the human soul. Some of them would spend long periods in reflection, distancing themselves from the noise of marketplaces and tribal disputes. They would look at the sky, the vastness of the desert, the order within creation, and come to a conclusion that seemed obvious to them, like that none of this could belong to powerless objects carved by human hands. The stars moved with precision, the seasons shifted with purpose, and life itself followed patterns that suggested control and wisdom far beyond what idols could offer. This quiet reflection became their form of resistance, a refusal to accept what everyone else accepted simply because it had always been that way. Yet even within their search, there was a sense of incompleteness. They knew what they rejected, but they did not have full clarity on what to embrace. Some followed remnants of earlier teachings, others tried to piece together fragments of monotheism that had survived through stories and traditions. But without a living prophet among them, without revelation being actively taught and preserved, their understanding remained partial. It was as if they were standing at the edge of truth, aware of its presence, but unable to fully grasp it. This feeling, this quiet tension between knowing and not knowing, speaks to something deeply human, the innate inclination toward recognizing the Creator, even when guidance is limited. Their existence is significant because it shows that even in a time described as Jahiliyyah, the light of truth had not been completely extinguished. It flickered in the hearts of those willing to question, those willing to stand apart, those willing to seek. And this flicker would soon be met with a flame that would illuminate everything. At the same time, while some were searching for clarity, others were deeply entangled in beliefs about the unseen that were shaped more by fear than by understanding. So the concept of the unseen world was not foreign to the people of Arabia. They believed in jinn, in forces that existed beyond human perception, and in influences that could affect their lives in ways they could not fully control. But without guidance, these beliefs became mixed with superstition, leading people down paths that often increased their fear rather than brought them closer to truth. Soothsayers became figures of influence in this environment. They claimed access to hidden knowledge, speaking in cryptic language that left listeners both fascinated and unsettled. People would seek them out for answers about the future, about decisions, about unseen dangers that might be approaching. These soothsayers often relied on fragments of truth mixed with falsehood, creating an illusion of knowledge that drew people in. Their words carried weight, not because they were always accurate, but because people wanted certainty in a world that felt unpredictable. There were also practices meant to seek protection from unseen harm. Charms, amulets, and rituals were used in an attempt to guard against misfortune. Some would tie objects to themselves or their children, believing these items held protective power. Others would perform specific acts before journeys or important decisions, hoping to influence outcomes that were ultimately beyond their control. These actions reveal something important, that people were aware of forces greater than themselves, but they did not know how to properly relate to those forces. Instead of turning directly to Allah with trust and reliance, they turned to created things, and hoping to find security in what could neither harm nor benefit them. The Quran would later address these misconceptions with clarity, affirming the existence of jinn while correcting the exaggerated fears surrounding them. It would teach that they, like humans, are created beings, not objects of worship or ultimate authority. It would dismantle the idea that soothsayers possessed reliable knowledge of the unseen, reminding people that true knowledge of what is hidden belongs only to Allah. This shift was not just about correcting beliefs. It was about transforming how people understood control, fear, and reliance. Before that transformation, however, fear often shaped behavior in subtle but powerful ways. People avoided certain places, certain times, certain actions, all based on inherited beliefs about unseen dangers. Decisions were sometimes guided more by superstition than by reason. This created a constant undercurrent of anxiety, where the unknown was not approached with trust in a higher power, but with attempts to manipulate or avoid it through rituals that had no true foundation. And when you place this alongside the presence of the Hunafa, the contrast becomes striking. On one side, you have individuals seeking truth through reflection and rejecting false intermediaries. On the other, you have a society deeply engaged in practices that placed intermediaries everywhere, between themselves and the Creator, between themselves and their fears, between themselves and the unseen. One path moved toward clarity, even if incomplete. The other moved deeper into confusion, even if it felt familiar. And this tension is what makes the moment before revelation so powerful. It was not a time of simple ignorance, but a time of searching, of confusion, of partial truths and deep misunderstandings existing side by side. Some hearts were ready, already leaning toward something greater, while others were firmly rooted in practices that would be challenged in ways they could not yet imagine. And it is precisely in this environment, where the questions were already forming but the answers had not yet arrived, that the message of Islam would soon descend, not just to inform, but to transform, to replace fear with certainty, confusion with clarity, and scattered fragments of truth with a complete and final guidance. There is something deeply striking about a society that has preserved fragments of truth, yet no longer has a living source to renew and clarify it. Arabia, in that period before Islam, was not completely disconnected from divine history. The names of Ibrahim and Ismail, peace be upon them, were not unknown. The Kaaba still stood as a physical reminder of a time when worship was directed purely to Allah. Certain practices, like pilgrimage and sacrifice, had roots in that earlier guidance. But over generations, without a prophet to teach, correct, and restore, those practices slowly shifted. Meanings were altered, intentions were diluted, and new customs were added until the original message became almost unrecognizable. This absence of revelation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, in a way that might not have been obvious to those living through it. Each generation inherited what the previous one had practiced, rarely questioning whether it was still aligned with truth. What began as small changes eventually became deeply rooted traditions. By the time this period reached its peak, people were no longer aware of how far they had drifted. They believed they were honoring their ancestors, preserving sacred customs, and maintaining a connection to something divine, yet much of what they practiced had no foundation in the original message. This is one of the most important realities to understand. When guidance is absent, human beings do not simply remain neutral. They fill the space with their own interpretations, desires, and assumptions. Over time, these fill the gap so completely that they feel natural, even unquestionable. In Arabia, this meant that acts of worship became intertwined with cultural identity. The rituals surrounding the Kaaba, and for example, were no longer purely about devotion to Allah. They became occasions for pride, display, and competition between tribes. People would perform acts that they believed brought them closer to the divine, yet those acts were often directed toward idols or shaped by customs that had no basis in revelation. The Quran later addresses this directly, not only correcting specific practices, but also challenging the mindset that allowed them to persist. It repeatedly asks people to reflect, to question, to consider whether what they follow is truly based on knowledge or simply inherited without thought. This call to reflection is powerful because it breaks the cycle of blind imitation. It reminds people that truth is not determined by how long something has been practiced, but by whether it is aligned with what Allah has revealed. Next, without revelation, moral guidance also became fragmented. People developed their own standards of right and wrong, often based on what benefited them or their tribe. This created a world where contradictions were everywhere. A person could be admired for generosity and courage, yet participate in injustice without seeing any conflict in that. A tribe could pride itself on protecting its members, yet show no concern for those outside its circle. The absence of a unifying moral framework meant that values were inconsistent, shifting depending on circumstances. This inconsistency extended into everyday life. Decisions were often driven by immediate needs, social expectations, or personal gain, rather than a sense of accountability to a higher authority. There was little awareness that actions would be judged beyond this world. The concept of a final reckoning existed in fragments, but it was not central enough to shape behavior in a consistent way. As a result, people lived largely focused on the present, on survival, on status, on maintaining honor, without a clear understanding of ultimate accountability. And yet, even within this absence, there was a kind of preparation taking place. The emptiness created by the lack of revelation was not meaningless. It created a space where the arrival of guidance would not just be noticed, but deeply felt. When people live in confusion long enough, clarity becomes powerful. When people search without finding complete answers, they become more receptive to truth when it finally arrives. This is what makes this period so significant. It was not just a time of decline, and it was also a time that set the stage for transformation. At the same time, the society was filled with moral contradictions that revealed both its potential and its need for change. There were qualities that, if guided properly, could become sources of strength and goodness. Hospitality, for example, was not a small matter. It was a deeply rooted value. A traveler arriving in a settlement could expect to be welcomed, fed, and protected, sometimes for days, without being asked for anything in return. This generosity was a point of pride, a reflection of honor that people took seriously. Stories were told of individuals who would sacrifice their own comfort to ensure that a guest was treated with dignity. Courage was another defining trait. In a land where survival was uncertain, bravery was essential. People faced harsh conditions, long journeys, and constant threats, and they developed a resilience that allowed them to endure. In battle, courage was celebrated, and those who showed fearlessness were remembered and praised. Loyalty, too, was highly valued. Standing by one's word, defending one's tribe, and fulfilling promises were seen as marks of integrity. But here is where the contradiction becomes clear. These same qualities, when not guided by revelation, could also contribute to injustice. Loyalty to one's tribe, for example, could mean supporting them even when they were wrong. Courage in battle could become aggression without restraint. Generosity could be selective, extended only to those who enhanced one's reputation or belonged to one's group. Without a higher standard to define how and when these qualities should be applied, they could easily be misused. And this is why the coming of Islam did not erase these traits, but refined them. It preserved what was noble and redirected it toward justice and righteousness. Loyalty was no longer blind, it was tied to truth. Courage was no longer about dominance, it was about standing for what is right. Generosity was no longer about reputation, it became an act of worship done sincerely for the sake of Allah. This transformation shows that the society was not without value, it simply needed guidance to align those values correctly. Another powerful contradiction lay in how people viewed honor. Honor was everything. A person's reputation could shape their entire life, and preserving that reputation was often more important than anything else. This led to acts of bravery and generosity, but it also led to harmful practices. And the fear of shame could drive decisions that were deeply unjust, including the treatment of women and the extreme actions taken to avoid perceived dishonor. This reveals how a concept that could have been positive became distorted when it was not anchored in divine guidance. When you step back and observe all of this together, a pattern begins to emerge. Arabia before Islam was not simply a place of darkness, nor was it a society devoid of all good. It was a complex environment where strengths and weaknesses existed side by side, where noble qualities were present but misdirected, and where fragments of truth remained but were overshadowed by confusion. It was a society waiting, even if it did not realize it, for something that would bring clarity, balance, and purpose. And that is what makes the moment just before revelation so powerful. It was a time when the need for guidance had reached its peak, when the contradictions had become too significant to ignore, and when the foundations were in place for a message that would not only correct beliefs, but reshape an entire way of life. As time moved forward, something subtle yet powerful was unfolding beneath the surface of Arabian society. It was not visible in the marketplaces, nor was it openly discussed in tribal gatherings, but it could be felt in the unease that lingered within thoughtful hearts. The contradictions had become too obvious to ignore. A people known for eloquence could not explain the truth of their own worship. A society that valued honor could not justify the injustice it allowed. A land that preserved the legacy of Ibrahim could not reconcile that legacy with the idols surrounding the Kaaba, as there was a growing tension, not always spoken but deeply present, as if the world itself was waiting for something to break through the silence. Beyond Arabia, the wider world was also in a state of imbalance. Powerful empires existed, yet they were consumed by internal corruption and external conflict. Belief systems had become fragmented, altered, or burdened with layers of human interpretation that distanced them from their original message. In this global atmosphere, truth felt scattered, as if pieces of it existed in different places but were no longer united in a clear and accessible form. Arabia, though often seen as isolated, stood at a crossroads of trade and culture, quietly positioned in a way that would soon become significant. It was not the center of power, but it was ready to become the center of transformation. As within Mecca itself, life continued with its familiar rhythms. Trade caravans moved in and out, bringing goods and stories from distant lands. Tribal leaders maintained their influence, ensuring that the balance of power remained in their favor. The Kaaba continued to attract visitors, not for the worship of Allah alone, but for a mixture of rituals that had lost their original meaning. Yet even here, in the heart of this system, there were signs that not everyone was fully at ease. There were individuals who withdrew from the noise, who sought solitude, who felt that the answers they were surrounded by were not enough. Among these individuals was a man known for his honesty, his integrity, and his deep sense of reflection. He was not shaped by the corruption of his environment, nor was he comfortable with its practices. He observed, then he thought, and he questioned, not in a loud or confrontational way, but with a quiet sincerity that set him apart. He would spend time away from the distractions of society, reflecting on the state of his people and the world around him. This was not the behavior of someone satisfied with the status quo. It was the behavior of someone searching, even if he did not yet know what he was searching for, and this is where the story reaches a moment of profound significance. Because when a society reaches a point where its contradictions can no longer be ignored, when individuals begin to question what they once accepted without thought, when the emptiness created by the absence of revelation becomes deeply felt, that is when the stage is set for change. Not a small change, not a temporary shift, none but a transformation that reaches into every aspect of life. The arrival of that transformation did not come through force, nor did it emerge from political ambition or social reform movements. It came through revelation. It came as words, yet not like any words the people had ever heard before. When the Quran began to be revealed, it did not simply present new ideas. It challenged everything that had been built on falsehood, and at the same time, it affirmed what was true, but had been forgotten. It spoke directly to the human heart, calling it back to its creator, reminding it of its purpose, and awakening it from a state of heedlessness. The message was clear and uncompromising. There is no God but Allah. No idols, no intermediaries, no shared authority. This statement alone was enough to shake the foundations of the society. And it was not just a theological claim, it was a complete redefinition of power, authority, and identity. It removed the influence of idols, challenged the authority of tribal leaders who benefited from the existing system, and placed every individual on equal ground before their creator. It did not matter what tribe you belonged to, how much wealth you had, or what status you held. What mattered was your relationship with Allah and your actions. The Quran did not stop at belief. It addressed the very issues that had defined the society. It spoke about justice, emphasizing the rights of the weak, the orphan, the poor. It condemned the burial of infant girls, exposing it as a crime against humanity and a violation of the trust given by Allah. It redefined the role of women, granting them rights that had been denied, and restoring their dignity as individuals created with purpose and value. It challenged economic practices, warning against exploitation and encouraging fairness and charity. It addressed the unseen, removing superstition and replacing it with clear understanding. Every aspect of life was touched, corrected, and elevated. What makes this transformation even more remarkable is how it unfolded. It did not happen overnight. Hearts do not change instantly, especially when they are deeply attached to tradition. The message was revealed gradually, guiding people step by step, allowing them to reflect, to question, and to grow. Some resisted, unable to let go of what they had always known. Others recognized the truth and embraced it, even when it came at great personal cost. Families were divided, alliances were tested, and the society was forced to confront a reality it could no longer ignore. Yet through all of this, something undeniable was taking place. The same people who once measured worth by tribe began to see each other as equals in faith. The same society that once neglected the weak began to protect them. The same individuals who once sought honor through pride began to seek it through humility and obedience to Allah. This was not just a shift in belief. It was a complete transformation of identity. And when you look back at what Arabia was before Islam, the contrast becomes clear in a way that is almost overwhelming. A land once defined by fragmentation became united. A society once driven by cycles of revenge began to value forgiveness and justice. A people once surrounded by idols turned toward the worship of the one who created everything. The change was not superficial, it was deep, touching the heart, the mind, and the way people lived their lives every single day. This is why understanding that earlier period is so important. It allows you to see the full weight of what was transformed. It shows you that Islam did not enter a perfect world. It entered a world in need of guidance, and it provided that guidance with clarity, wisdom, and mercy. It took what was broken and restored it, took what was good and refined it, and brought together what had been scattered into a complete and balanced way of life. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this. The same message that transformed that society is still present today, unchanged, preserved, and accessible. The same words that corrected their misunderstandings, that guided their hearts, that reshaped their world, continue to speak with the same clarity and power. It is not a message confined to history. It is a message that continues to invite, to guide, and to transform, just as it did when it first descended into a land waiting for light.